Hi there, happy Monday. It's read aloud time, spring according to Humphrey. We're going to finish chapter 7 today. There's still been a lot of talk about these tadpoles that are growing and sort of making Og feel a little bit uncomfortable. I think he's maybe feeling a little bit jealous of these tadpoles. So let's finish chapter 7 and see what happens. All right, here we go. It's called Test Trouble. In the morning, all my friends entered room 26 and ran straight down to the aquarium to see if the tadpoles had grown. Slow down Simon groaned when he got there. They haven't changed a bit. It's going to take a while, Joey reminded him. Simon groaned again. Only one student didn't look at the tadpoles. Calm down, Cassie. She went right to her chair and stared down at the top of her table. Once class began, Mrs. Brisbane said, I know you all studied last night, so why don't we take the math test now and get it out of the way? There were groans. There always were when our teacher said the word test. Now? Do it now, Daniel asked. Mrs. Brisbane smiled nicely and said yes. Soon my friends were bent over their papers, scribbling away, all except for Cassie. She stared at the paper with her arms wrapped around her middle. Cassie stared and stared, but she didn't even pick up her pencil. Mrs. Brisbane noticed, and she walked over to Cassie's desk. Is something wrong? She asked. Cassie didn't look up. She mumbled something about her stomach hurting. Mrs. Brisbane leaned down and whispered something. I couldn't hear. Cassie shook her head. I thought she might even cry. Our teacher told Cassie to go to the nurse's office, where she could lie down. As soon as she left, Stop Talking Sophie asked, Where is she going? Mrs. Brisbane explained that Cassie didn't feel well. She never feels well when we take a test, Daniel grumbled. Then he grabbed his stomach and said, Oh, my stomach. That's enough, Daniel, Mrs. Brisbane said. I'll speak to you later. Now, no more talking during the test. I hopped on my wheel and started to spin. While my friends finished the test, I thought about what Daniel had said. It wasn't a kind thing to say, but to squeak the truth, Cassie had asked to go to the nurse's office the last 2 times the class took tests. I don't get to take math tests unless Mrs. Brisbane writes the problems on the board. Then I copy them into my notebook and work out the answers once school is over. I've taken spelling tests and vocabulary quizzes, but they never made me sick. So why did tests make Cassie's tummy hurt? When the test was over and the bell rang for recess, all of my classmates raced out of room 26, except for Daniel. Mrs. Brisbane asked him to stay. That was a very rude thing to say about Cassie, Mrs. Brisbane told him. But it's true, Daniel said. She just says her stomach hurts to get out of taking tests. You don't know that, Mrs. Brisbane said. Some people get very anxious about taking tests, and that might make her stomach hurt. But Daniel, it's none of your business. Cassie and I will discuss it in private. Okay, Daniel said. I won't say anything again. Thanks, Mrs. Brisbane replied. I expect you to keep your word. She excused him and he hurried out the door. It wasn't long before Cassie returned to room 26. Feeling better? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Cassie whispered, A little bit. Mrs. Brisbane asked her to sit down. I'm going to call your parents and suggest that they take you to the doctor to make sure nothing's wrong, she said. You might be sick, but since your stomach only seems to hurt when you take a test, maybe you worry about them a lot. Cassie admitted that taking tests made her nervous and made her stomach feel like it was tied in knots. If that's the case, we need to work on ways to make you less worried about tests, Mrs. Brisbane said. Your grades are fine. You know the material. Why do you worry so much? Cassie hung her head and softly said, It's just, I don't want to disappoint my parents. I don't think you'd disappoint them if you got a few answers wrong now and then, Mrs. Brisbane said. They'd still love you, don't you think? Cassie slowly nodded. Sometimes we learn more from our mistakes than our successes, Mrs. Brisbane suggested. I'd certainly learned what not to do with the blinds cord when I made a mistake. Then Mrs. Brisbane taught her a little trick. The next time you feel your stomach knotting up, take some long, slow breaths, like this. Mrs. Brisbane took a very long breath in, held it, and slowly let the air out. Let's try it together, she said. Yes, let's, I squeaked. Mrs. Brisbane and Cassie tried the breathing together, and I did too. Breathe in slowly, Mrs. Brisbane said. Hold, and slowly breathe out. I was amazed that I felt relaxed and calm after a couple of breaths. Does that make you feel a little better? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Yes, I squeaked. Cassie nodded. Why don't you stay in for afternoon recess and take the test? Mrs. Brisbane suggested. You might feel calmer if the other students aren't here. Cassie did a lot of deep breathing as she took the test later in the day. I breathed along with her just to help her feel better. I felt better too. I hope it wasn't as bad as you'd expected, Mrs. Brisbane said when Cassie turned in her test. It wasn't, Cassie said, and then she smiled. Phew. Humphrey's spring things. Spring's full of flowers and all the rest, but spring can also put you to the test. That's the end of chapter 7. Tomorrow we'll start chapter 8. It's called The Big Break. I hope you're enjoying the book so far. We're about halfway through. All right, have a great day. Bye.